Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Diane Lalonde, and I am a research and knowledge mobilization specialist with the Learning Network. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to our webinar, Supporting Survivors of Gender-Based Violence in Their Animals, Innovative and Collaborative Strategies. I want to acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chungatang nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. We are happy to be joined today by Claire Delude and Sue O'Neill, and I'll invite you to turn your cameras on now. And we're going to begin with a presentation by Claire and Sue before moving into the Q&A. And so I'll pass it over to both of you to get us started.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. Welcome to our presentation on innovative and collaborative strategies to supporting survivors of gender-based violence and their animals. So before we jump in, we want to acknowledge that Humane Canada is a remote organization. And as a remote organization, we acknowledge the many Indigenous nations and communities that have relationships with these lands since time immemorial where our work takes place. We express our gratitude to all Indigenous communities, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, for their past, present, and future leadership and stewardship. We're inspired by and grateful for Indigenous ways of knowing that teach us the interdependency and interconnectedness of all life forms and our relationship of mutual reliance and shared destiny with other people, with animals, and with the earth. We encourage everyone to learn more about the Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land you reside on. And if you'd like to do this, you can learn more at native-land.ca. In fact, if you'd like to pop in the chat where you're joining from today, that would be wonderful. We want to acknowledge as well that this affirmation is in part inspired by the words of Honorable Maurice Sinclair in his speeches to the Senate of Canada regarding Indigenous ways of knowing and animal welfare. So before we go any further, we'll just take a moment to introduce ourselves as the ACT project team. My name is Claire. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the coordinator for both the ACT project and for Humane Canada's National Pet Food Bank. To give a physical description of myself for anyone with visual impairments, I'm a white woman with long, wavy brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue and black flowery blouse. I hold a master's degree in animal behavior and welfare from the University of Guelph, and I'm also a proud alumnus of Lakehead University. Before I joined Humane Canada, I held many different positions within a Humane Society organization, including animal care and administrative roles, and with the adjoining low-cost spay-neuter clinic. This is where I really developed my interest for increasing veterinary access to remote and to underserved communities, and a passion for keeping animals and their families together. I share my home with a very hilarious canine companion named Dozer, who I affectionately refer to as my house hippo, and who lives up to his name by being very, very good at taking naps, And I'm joining today from Belleville, Ontario, where I live, work, and play as an uninvited guest on the Crawford Purchase 1783 Treaty Land, which is adjacent to the Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory and on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I'll just pass it over to Sue to introduce herself.
Of course, I had myself muted. Sorry, everyone. Hi, everyone. I am Sue O'Neill. I am the manager of the ACT project and Promising Practices project, and I go by she and her pronouns. To give a physical description of myself, I am a white woman with long dark hair, blue glasses, and a white blouse and red blazer. I hold a master's in education from Western University, and I'm a master's of women and gender studies candidate at St. Mary's University. Prior to joining Humane Canada, I worked in management at a gender-based violence shelter in Ontario and helped to develop their offsite animal safekeeping program. Later, I shifted into managing their community services team. I've also worked in the fields of education and mental health before working in animal welfare. As a survivor of gender-based violence, I feel passionately that survivors and all of their family members should be able to flee violence together. And as someone who's worked in gender-based violence services, I've seen the positive impact on survivors when they know that their animal family members are safe too. I have a cat companion named Mew who has traveled Canada with me. And today I'm located in Halifax, located on the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. And with that, I will pass it back to Claire.
Thank you. Okay, so as we get started, we want to take a moment right at the beginning to talk a little bit about language. Language is very important, and so is maintaining a space of openness to learning. So as we review, we want to define some language that's important to remember and utilize throughout our discussions. We do know that language can be misused and mistakes can be made, and so we encourage everyone to have an openness to learning from our mistakes. In the ACT project, we like to say we are humble and ready to fumble. We like to use language that is shared with us by Women at the Center, which is a national survivor-led organization, and they are one of the lead partners of the ACT project. So the language that we use includes survivors rather than victims, declarations rather than stories, reported rather than alleged, aggressor rather than perpetrator, and accomplice rather than ally. We also want to note that we're conscious of our use of imagery today. We want to contextualize that we intentionally use imagery to represent the animals that survivors may be responsible for or have a relationship with. So we're conscious that some images might not necessarily represent best practices regarding animal welfare, such as the keeping of animals that might traditionally be considered wildlife. But we want to ensure that no survivor voice is left out, regardless of the kind of animal that they have. We want to acknowledge the survivors that are in this space with us today, those who have self-identified and those who have not. We recognize that some survivors in this space might represent their sector while also holding their own survivor history. We appreciate the contributions that you bring to this work. If you want to debrief with myself or Sue after the webinar, we are more than happy to do so. You can reach either of us at our emails, which are our names at humanecanada.ca. So Claire at humanecanada.ca or Sue at humanecanada.ca. We will share all of our contact information and information about how to get involved at the end of the presentation as well. So don't worry if you missed it. Lastly, we want to encourage you to self-monitor. We're talking about a complex and potentially triggering topic today. So respect your own needs and take breaks as you see fit. We encourage you to stand and stretch and just be kind to yourself as we collaborate. So for the learning outcomes, after the presentation, you'll understand the link between animal violence and interpersonal violence. You'll be able to recognize the barriers survivors of gender-based violence and their animals face in securing safe shelter and housing. You'll learn about implementing a trauma-informed approach for survivors of gender-based violence with their animals, using the tools and educational resources from the ACT project. And you'll have new knowledge on how to build cross-sectoral partnerships to support survivors of gender-based violence with animals. So we'll start by sharing a little bit about the organization that we're a part of, which is Humane Canada. Humane Canada is Canada's national federation of SPCAs and humane societies, which represents more than 50 humane societies and SPCAs across the country. That's including in every province and in 2 of the 3 Canadian territories. Humane Canada's mission is to drive positive progressive change towards our vision of a humane Canada, which entails ending animal cruelty, improving animal protection, and promoting the humane treatment of all animals. Because many of Humane Canada's members investigate and enforce the animal cruelty sections of the Criminal Code, we do have frontline knowledge of the violence link, which is the relationship between violence against people and violence against animals. Within Humane Canada, we have the Justice and Legislative Affairs program, which works to raise awareness about the violence link and also to support legislative and policy amendments that will create lasting change in Canada's animal welfare landscape. We also have the Canadian Violence Link Coalition, and the ACT project works with Humane Canada's Canadian Violence Link Coalition to address systemic barriers for survivors with animals experiencing gender-based violence. As an organization, we've recognized that a big part of improving animal welfare across Canada is supporting people who care for animals. So we use a one welfare approach to build programs and frameworks that support the human-animal bond in order to improve the welfare of both humans and animals. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the ACT project and discuss the process that we took to develop the ACT to Keep Families Safe model for supporting survivors of gender-based violence with animals. So I'll start with the rationale of the project. So why is this important? Well, we know that more than half of Canadian households are multi-species households. This means there must be many survivors of gender-based violence with at least one animal that are confronting a system that does not include support or services for survivors with animals. We also know that COVID-19 increased animal adoptions and also exacerbated the effects of social isolation. So this means more people have animals, and survivors of gender-based violence are at a heightened risk of isolation. And to give a little bit more background, we'll discuss what the violence link is and how this impacts survivors of gender-based violence that have animals. So the violence link, like I mentioned, this is the strong link between animal violence and human violence. And there's an overlap between animal abuse and other forms of violence, such as intimate partner violence. So in instances of domestic violence, when there is an animal in the home, higher reports of animal abuse are commonly documented. To put this into perspective, we have a few statistics here. 56% of survivors of gender-based violence delay leaving violence because they had an animal in the home. 1 in 3 survivors of gender-based violence consider returning to violence because of their animal. And 1 in 8 survivors in Canada have reported experiencing threatened or enacted violence against their animal. So how do we confront the inadequate system of support that survivors of gender-based violence with animals are experiencing? This brings us to the ACT project. So the ACT project is a 3-year project funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada. Securing this funding meant that the ACT project could be created to address systemic barriers faced by survivors of gender-based violence and their animals. And before I go on, I just want to touch on two pieces of language here. So the first is the language of women. So this language was initially set out in our project, and we want to contextualize that this language is inclusive of anyone that identifies as a woman. But additionally, although we initially set out to support women specifically, we really want the outcomes of the project to be adaptable and applicable to all survivors of gender-based violence, no matter how they identify. The second piece is the language of animals. Like I mentioned, we want to contextualize that there are many different kinds of animals that a survivor might have a relationship with or be responsible for. This could include companion animals, farmed animals, service animals. It might even include wildlife. Really, this includes any animal that might impact a survivor's ability to leave violence. I also want to quickly mention that right now we are in the final month, in fact, final few weeks of this project. This project is wrapping up at the end of March, so it's a very exciting time for us to be able to share the products of this work with you all today. I want to mention, although the ACT project is coming to a close at the end of the month, the outcomes of the ACT project, including our online learning center and our newsletter, as well as our community of practice, which we hold quarterly, they will all continue to exist beyond the end of the ACT project. And so we'll share a little bit more, again, about how to get involved with the ACT project beyond the end of this month later in this presentation. We want to take a moment to give some appreciation to all of those who have contributed to this project. So first, we'd like to acknowledge the foundational work of Jasmine Ferreira, a PhD candidate at York University, who was the previous manager of the ACT project. Jasmine created the foundation from which the project was built and did an amazing job collaborating with all of our stakeholders to create the ACT to Keep Families Safe model. We'd also like to thank Andrea Andrade, who came onto the ACT project as an MSW student and then went on to contribute to the ACT project as an ACT coordinator, particularly doing fabulous work within our advocacy objectives, in writing our submission to the Federal Housing Advocate, and in fostering such meaningful relationships with our project partners and stakeholders. We also want to acknowledge the foundational work of those who were involved in the project since before it was even created. The research conducted that's foundational to this project was performed by researchers Dr. Amy Fitzgerald, Dr. Rochelle Stevenson, and Dr. Kendra Coulter. We express our deepest gratitude for the work these researchers have done with survivors and animals that underpins our work. Finally, we want to give a huge thank you to our funder, Women and Gender Equality Canada, for generously funding and supporting the ACT project. So the objectives of the ACT project are as follows. The first is to raise awareness and increase communication about the violence link among key sectors that engage with survivors experiencing gender-based violence and safety planning. The second is to develop and implement an adaptable collaborative response model, which we call the ACT to Keep Families Safe model, for animal owning survivors experiencing gender-based violence that can be adapted to underrepresented groups of women. So this includes Indigenous women, survivors, the official language minority community, which is French speakers outside of Quebec and English speakers within Quebec, and women living in rural, remote, northern, or farming communities. The third objective is to provide education, tools, resources, and access to the ACT to Keep Families Safe model to sectors that directly respond to survivors experiencing gender-based violence, specifically through an online learning center and through regional workshops. So we'll start to discuss the process of the ACT project by looking at the theory of change that we're applying to the goals of the project. The theory of change demonstrates the intended long-term systemic change that the goals of the project intended to create. As you can see, there are three inputs intended to create the systemic change. The first input is the digital campaign regarding the violence link. This has the overall goal of raising awareness about the violence link. The second input is the Act to Keep Families Safe model, which was initially called the ACRM. This contains the knowledge, information, and resources that we gathered from the roundtables. It includes the case studies, resources, system mapping, and the gap analysis. And then the third input is the sharing of the accessible tools and training through specialized workshops and through our online learning center. So as we follow this theory of change, we can come to the long-term outcomes intended by the inputs. We're hoping to have an increase in stakeholder awareness regarding the violence link, and an increase in cross-collaboration to support women with animals experiencing gender-based violence, and a decrease to barriers to offer safe housing for survivors with animals experiencing gender-based violence. When we think of our roundtables, we want to recognize the overall outcome goals. So we wanted to identify the additional stakeholders who needed to be part of the project. We wanted to identify the current resources that were available, what's already being used, what's successful, and we wanted to analyze the current gaps and the current challenges. Are there resources that could be created to support organization in overcoming these challenges and these gaps? We learned from our lead partner roundtables the need for collaboration across multiple sectors. This includes sectors that you might not really consider right away. So we explore this a little bit further in our collaboration guide, which is on the online learning center. We also heard very clearly that the resources and the model needed to be designed to be adaptable to community-based solutions because different communities have very different resources, very different challenges, and very different contexts. At our first roundtable, we completed a social network analysis, which is an interdisciplinary approach to mapping a stakeholder ecosystem. So this allows for visualizing data conceptually, as well as indicating relevancy or strength of the stakeholders. Typically, in the first step, you identify key stakeholders and words, and in step 2, you analyze and measure the centrality, so the closeness, frequency, and degree, which can be depicted in a sociogram. We began this process through a pre-survey where partners identified their networks and did some prioritization, and that allowed us to create an initial map of gender-based violence survivors with animals networks and identify the stakeholders' current ecosystems. We explore this analysis again a little bit further in our collaboration guide, which we'll discuss a little bit further on in the presentation. From Humane Canada's Canadian Violence Link Coalition work and during our lead partners roundtable, we were provided with many names of organizations and agencies that would be amazing to have to contribute to the project. We did have to prioritize these names due to budgetary and time limitations. And so we reached out to 287 organizations via email. We reached out to 120 of these that demonstrated interest for discovery calls, and that is what resulted with all of the incredible individuals and organizations that are on board with the project today. So we're completing this project largely in part due to our 40+ partners across the country. This is inclusive of animal and human service organizations that are shown in this graphic here. Because of their support, specifically our consultation and collaboration with them, their contributions helped to build the Act to Keep Families Safe model. Our collaboration with partners allowed us to integrate multiple perspectives and really reinforce the need for collaboration across sectors to create better programming and supports for survivors and their animals. And I know we have a lot of learners joining from Ontario today, so I just wanted to highlight the partners who are located in Ontario. This includes Shelter Movers, the Ontario Veterinary Medical Association, La Maison, Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, NISA Homes, Toronto Humane, Action Ontarienne, Covenant House, Native Women's Resource Center of Toronto, Interval House, both of Hamilton and Ottawa, and the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses. So as we reviewed our social network analysis from our lead partner roundtable, we did a SLOC analysis, which is strengths, limitations, opportunities, and challenges. And we asked our partners to share the strengths, limitations, opportunities, and challenges that they observed within their organization and within their community for supporting survivors of gender-based violence with animals. And then we asked them to use affinity diagramming to determine the themes of the data collected, as well as to prioritize the data. So we learned that there was a need for networking opportunities, education and training, resources for service providers and for survivors, for funding, partnership and collaboration opportunities, advocacy tools, and awareness raising. And that brings us to the model. So our lead partners gathered together for a workshop to build the model, which resulted in creating a model with 6 building blocks, which is shown here and is called the Act to Keep Families Safe model. The model was created to offer support to service providers supporting survivors of gender-based violence with animals, and it was designed to support organizations that were already supporting survivors, as well as organizations that are just beginning their journey of supporting survivors. So really there's kind of something for everyone when it comes to your journey on supporting survivors. The model is inclusive, as survivors and members of the public can also learn and take action with the Act to Keep Families Safe model. The model includes resources, education, tools, and much more to support organizations and champions to build or expand upon animal safekeeping programs that support survivors and their animals. These are offered through the 6 building blocks of the model, which includes tools and templates, education and training, networks and partnerships, advocacy, case studies and stories, and engagement and awareness. And we'll share a little bit more about what each of these building blocks entails later in the presentation. For now, I'll pass it over to Sue to discuss GBV and the impact of animals.
Thank you so much, Claire. So we know that survivors of gender-based violence experience complex challenges and barriers when seeking to leave a violent relationship. And this is especially true for survivors with animals. And this is even true even when there are animal-friendly gender-based violence shelters or shelters with off-site animal safekeeping programs. So, the decision to leave a violent relationship is difficult, as survivors may depend on their aggressor for housing, be financially dependent on them, their finances may be intertwined, and they may feel particularly vulnerable due to financial abuse. Survivors may also fear an escalation of violence if they do choose to leave, and if there are children and/or animals in the home, survivors may be concerned for their safety as well. Leaving is made further complex when considering the needs of the animals in a survivor's life, which is our focus today. Survivors can experience challenges in accessing animal-friendly or inclusive shelters and services. The bond between a survivor and their animals may cause them to delay leaving or reconsider leaving. The aggressor may also use that bond to coerce and control, and in some cases, the aggressor may threaten harm against or actually harm the animal in an effort to control the survivor or prevent them from leaving. When a survivor does leave, there are barriers to accessing animal-friendly and on-site sheltering options. Few emergency shelters are inclusive of animals or have placement options for animals. In 2018, only 1% of Canadian domestic violence shelters provided on-site sheltering for companion animals. This is a major barrier to survivors who must choose between safety and leaving their animal behind with an aggressor, where they may be concerned for the safety of their animal or may be dealing with an impossible choice of having to give their animal up entirely. For off-site animal sheltering options, these programs are often short-term. Individuals fleeing violence may not know the exact length of time they will need for their animals to be in care, and they may not have other housing options once that time limit is met. Additionally, once that time limit is met, survivors may experience precarious housing or homelessness. Offsite sheltering can also be a difficult option for survivors because they might not be able to visit their animals depending on the program. Being separated can create worry about their animals and leave them without the emotional support and companionship that the animals bring to their lives. We know that survivors have described pets or animals as important as children, and research has shown that animals may also suffer emotional trauma being separated, and the separation may additionally create trauma for their humans. The ideal solution is on-site co-sheltering so that survivors can be with their whole family. But we are also mindful that organizations have noted their own barriers to implementing this. That include lack of resources, funds, staffing, training, or more. There are additional barriers in accessing animal-friendly housing. There's no clear standardized approach to housing across Canada for the allowance of pets in homes and in shelters. In 1990, Ontario prohibited no pets clauses in rental contracts. A landlord cannot prohibit the presence of pets at the premises. The same, though, cannot be said in other provinces and territories. And even when survivors do attempt to access safe, affordable housing in Ontario, they may still experience discrimination from landlords because they have pets. In addition to the rising costs of housing and a lack of safe housing, survivors with animals will experience a lot of difficulty in finding housing because there are limited options out there. And this further keeps survivors with animals stuck in violent and dangerous situations. These barriers can create life-changing situations for survivors and animals. As mentioned before, the lack of animal-friendly or inclusive sheltering and housing can create a situation where survivors are forced to make an impossible decision and delay leaving, or they don't leave at all and remain in the abusive relationship. Survivors and their animals may experience further trauma from staying, or if they do leave, from being separated from their animals temporarily or permanently. Survivors who do leave, and even survivors who are able to access services, may experience being precariously housed or unhoused, as the length of programs for survivors and their animals may not be an adequate amount of time for them to secure safe, animal-friendly, affordable housing. So, how do we support survivors of gender-based violence and their animals? How do we actually create solutions that provide support that these survivors and their animals need, while we also mitigate the trauma of being separated from their animals and offer options for long-term safety and housing? Although we do not have all the answers within this project, we have found strategies, innovative solutions, and ideas that organizations and champions can learn from to be able to design or expand animal safekeeping programs in their own communities. We are now going to explore these solutions, ideas, and strategies through the categories of awareness, collaboration, and tools, which that is where our acronym ACT came from. We'll begin by exploring awareness. Within the category of awareness, the two building blocks from the ACT to Keep Families Safe model are advocacy and engagement and awareness. These two building blocks are focused on raising awareness of survivors' needs through advocacy, as well as engaging with the public and other organizations through raising awareness about survivors of gender-based violence and their animals. In the ACT project, we heard from numerous survivors, as well as service providers, that there is a need for animal-friendly housing across Canada. Survivors struggle to find safe, affordable, accessible animal-friendly housing after fleeing violence. As mentioned, Ontario does have legislation to protect survivors with animals. However, often landlords still discriminate against survivors with animals. The rest of Canada does not offer any sort of legislation regarding individuals with animals. Although animal-friendly housing is beyond the scope of the ACT project, we've put together a submission for the Federal Housing Advocate as a way to share the information that we learned through this project regarding housing. We have also incorporated research survivor voices from a survivor survey we conducted, as well as organizational feedback from case studies into this submission. We also encourage organizations to engage with their own local and community advocacy regarding animal-friendly housing, particularly with local landlords, to support survivors and animals. Another area of advocacy that came from the ACT project was regarding service animals. This is another area beyond the scope of the project. However, we heard from survivors and service providers that survivors with service animals were facing additional barriers and challenges when attempting to access gender-based violence shelters and/or accessible housing. It's important for gender-based violence organizations to have clear policies regarding how survivors with service animals will be supported. Gender-based violence shelters are encouraged to prepare for service animals through ensuring that space is ready, as well as supplies are on hand, such as animal beds, food, and bowls. As legislation across Canada regarding service animals is fragmented and confusing, this does mean that survivors who flee from one province to another may face discrimination or barriers in certain provinces due to their animal not having qualifications or certifications expected of a service animal in that province. There's a significant need for advocacy for survivors with service animals to ensure access to shelters, housing, and services. The ACT project team has created resources and tools to support organizations in their own advocacy work. These tools include an advocacy guide, which outlines strategies for how to successfully advocate for survivors of gender-based violence in your community, resources to support survivors with service animals, including considerations for your own organization to be able to better support survivors with service animals when they approach you for service, resources to support advocacy efforts for housing with survivors with animals, including a resource specifically to support survivors in understanding their rights and advocating with their own landlord. Awareness of the violence link, as well as the support survivors with the support survivors with animals may need, is an integral part of building programs that keep families together. The ACT project has had 2 awareness campaigns that successfully raised awareness across Canada regarding the impact of animal ownership and violence towards animals and survivors of gender-based violence. Raising awareness regarding the violence link can also support animal safekeeping programs in raising awareness of the needs of these programs and/or survivors accessing these programs. This can also support organizations in fundraising, finding volunteers, as well as developing partnerships. The ACT project team has created resources and tools to support organizations in their own awareness raising. These tools include survivor stories and survivor quotes that offer deeper insight into the journeys of survivors, as well as a social media toolkit with multiple social media assets for organizations to be able to utilize this for their own social media campaigns for awareness raising and fundraising. Now we will discuss the collaboration portion of the ACT project. Within the category of collaboration, there are 2 building blocks from the ACT to Keep Families Safe model. These are networks and partnerships, and case studies and survivor stories. These 2 building blocks focus on connecting human service organizations and animal service organizations to build collaborative partnerships to successfully support survivors and their animals. This work cannot be done alone. Gender-based violence organizations that offer co-sheltering have highlighted to us time and time again that their co-sheltering programs are successful because of the partnerships they have built with other organizations in their community, from animal to human services. This is also what we hear from offsite animal safekeeping programs. Cross-sectoral collaboration is needed to build programs to support survivors and their animals. The ACT project is an example of that collaboration. Our 40+ partners work together in numerous roundtables, workshops, and community conversations to design the ACT to Keep Families Safe model. Without input from each of these organizations, the model would not have been able to be created. The perspective of both human and animal services, as well as survivors, is integral to building programs that meet the ongoing needs of survivors and their animals. Let's review the top partnerships that we saw in our social network analysis. When we reviewed this data, we were able to see that the types of organizations that partnerships were being built with and that partnerships should be prioritized with when you're planning to work with survivors of gender-based violence with animals included animal welfare organizations, emergency housing for gender-based violence or violence against women organizations, animal health services, gender-based violence survivor communities, and Indigenous communities. The social network analysis, which mapped the closeness of partnerships as stated by Claire, currently is discussed further in our collaboration guide. So the ACT project team has created resources and tools to support organizations in building those collaborative relationships that are so important for them to be able to successfully support survivors with animals. These tools include a collaboration guide, which includes the data and themes found from the social network analysis to be able to support your organization in developing collaborative partnerships that can successfully initiate or grow your animal safekeeping program. We also offer an opportunity to network and build partnerships through the ACT to Keep Families Safe community of practice. These are quarterly meetings with an opportunity to learn from volunteer speakers on a particular topic for the first 30 minutes, and then offer 30 minutes of a facilitated discussion to be able to network and build partnerships with other organizations, as well as hear about successful programs and discuss how to address challenges that other organizations may be experiencing as they work with survivors and their animals. If you are interested in registering for the next community of practice in April, please check out our online learning center for more details and registration. And then we have the ACT to Keep Families Safe newsletter. This is a quarterly update on our new resources, tools, templates, and educational opportunities of the ACT project, Promising Practices project, and other Humane Canada initiatives, as well as the initiatives and projects of our partners. The ACT project team was also fortunate enough to interview human and animal service organizations across Canada that were supporting survivors of gender-based violence with animals in innovative and creative ways. This included interviewing animal-friendly shelters such as Interval House of Ottawa or Bethesda House, as well as gender-based violence shelters offering off-site animal safekeeping programs like Genesis House, as well as gender-based violence organizations offering boarding or fostering programs, as well as service animal organizations. The case studies are located on the ACT to Keep Families Safe online learning center and offer valuable insight into innovative ways communities and organizations have collaborated to be able to support survivors with their animals. We will now move into our final section discussing the tools portion of the ACT project. Within the category of tools, the two building blocks from the ACT to Keep Families Safe model are tools and templates and education and training. These two building blocks are focused on supporting organizations, survivors, and the general public in developing skills and programs to support survivors of gender-based violence with animals. Throughout our consultations, we heard about the positive impact of smaller achievable actions in creating larger sustainable change. These achievable actions look different across organizations, but overall the key to success was making small changes to better support survivors with animals, which in many cases led to innovative programs and big, brave ideas. Achievable actions in gender-based violence shelters can include starting with collecting data on crisis or intake calls in order to assess the number of survivors with animals who call for support. This can be as simple as collecting and reflecting on how many survivors have animals, or it could extend to include more detailed questions such as, are the animals a barrier to the survivor leaving? The number and type of animals the survivor is caring for, or any other data your organization might find helpful to better understand the needs of survivors and their animals. This data can also help in applying for funding, demonstrating the need for a program for survivors and animals, as well as preparing for how many animals you may encounter if launching an animal safekeeping program. Another achievable action can include educating individuals within your organization about the barriers and challenges facing survivors with animals. This could include training your staff about the issue, preparing resources to have on hand, and sharing those available resources with survivors with animals when they contact your organization for support. It could also include informing your donors about the challenges and barriers that survivors face when they have animals. It may also include the lack of informing your donors about the lack of programs available to reduce these barriers, or the work your organization is doing to support survivors with animals. Additionally, you could advocate by utilizing your organization's social media to educate your audience through an awareness campaign. Finally, an achievable action that can create big change is beginning to build collaborative partnerships with other organizations across sectors to support survivors of gender-based violence with animals. Small ways to begin to collaborate may include sharing resources and education with other organizations, including those in other sectors. This may also include beginning to initiate partnerships with smaller achievable actions, such as the sharing of resources, and this might lead to larger collaborations, which can include potentially building collaborative programs with other gender-based violence agencies, humane societies, SPCAs, and veterinary clinics. It's important to note supporting survivors with their animals and keeping families together is being trauma-informed. The Act to Keep Families Safe model, as well as the resources, tools, templates, and education can all be found on the Act to Keep Families Safe online learning center. This online learning center expands upon the model and offers a space for organizations and champions and survivors to learn, explore, and grow. There have been 12 educational modules developed to support organizations in furthering their knowledge regarding how to support survivors of gender-based violence with animals. These modules were created collaboratively with the ACT project team and subject matter experts. These modules include the violence link in gender-based violence, trauma-informed care with animals in social service settings, supporting survivors with animals, trauma-informed care in animal service settings, supporting survivors with animals, co-sheltering on-site, sheltering animals off-site, supporting rural, remote, northern, and farming communities. And I would just like to pause here to highlight a module, Sheltering Animals Offsite, as it was created and recorded by Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, a gender-based violence shelter in Ontario, with the Guelph Humane Society. This module highlights a strong partnership built in Guelph to support survivors with animals, including farmed and larger companion animals. This module also highlights strategies, innovative practices, and creative solutions to support other gender-based violence shelters and animal welfare organizations in building their own partnerships to support survivors of gender-based violence with animals. As well, we have the modules, service animals and disability rights, legal concerns and ownership, awareness, engagement, and confidentiality, self-care, compassion, fatigue, and setting boundaries, supporting Indigenous survivors and communities, and our bonus module that shares an in-depth look at an animal-friendly gender-based violence shelter in Ontario, Bethesda House. This module highlights the strategies and structure that have supported Bethesda House to successfully offer a pet-friendly shelter for 10 years, as well as an inside look at the data they have collected demonstrating the need for animal-friendly gender-based violence shelters. The ACT team has created 50 resources to support organizations, survivors, and the general public. These resources include information sheets and awareness resources that can be shared with other organizations, the general public, and/or survivors. These resources include information regarding barriers to animal-friendly housing, the challenges survivors may face in leaving a violent relationship with their animals, and foundational knowledge on the violence link. The ACT Project team also created tools like a safety planning tool with animals, as well as tools to support survivors in finding resources and support. The resources for helping to find support includes a guide for survivors specifically to support their self-advocacy, as well as develop their skills to be able to find and access resources in their communities that will best support their needs. There are also numerous template forms and policies created to support organizations, both human and animal, in building animal safekeeping programs that may be co-sheltering or offer animal safekeeping offsite. These templates include memorandums of understanding, intake forms for GBV shelters and animal welfare services, as well as template policies and procedures. These templates were designed to support gender-based violence shelters to be able to implement co-sheltering and animal offsite safekeeping programs a little bit easier. Finally, the resource section of the ACT to Keep Families Safe Online Learning Center also includes resources created by our incredible partners. These resources can further support organizations and survivors, and we really encourage you to check them out. There's even more training, educational opportunities, as well as guides to support your organization in furthering your work to better be able to help survivors. We appreciate your attention today, and before we wrap up our presentation, we wanted to highlight some ways to be involved and connect with the ACT project. We would really love for everyone here today to get involved, and there are some really easy ways to do that. We encourage you to sign up for the ACT newsletter. This is a quarterly newsletter on our resources, tools, templates, as well as that of our partners. If you are doing innovative work with survivors of gender-based violence and animals, we would love to feature your organization's work in one of our newsletters. We also encourage you to attend the ACT to Keep Families Safe community of practice to learn and connect with other champions in your region. We highly encourage you to download the resources, tools, and templates from our online learning center, as well as participate in one of our online learning modules and share your feedback. So as we mentioned, the ACT project is wrapping up this month, but Humane Canada has begun another project that is also generously funded by WAGE. This project focuses on developing promising practices in humane education to engage young men and boys as allies in ending gender-based violence. We are thrilled to begin this project, and we are actively seeking partners from gender-based violence services to be on the steering committee for this project. This project will develop gender transformative educational practices for humane educators to implement with young boys and men to develop their knowledge and skills as allies in ending gender-based violence. This program will be evaluated for its impact on addressing root causes of violence. A community of practice and online learning center will be developed through this project to offer free access for gender-based violence educational programs and humane education programs to resources, curriculum guides, and more to engage young men and boys as allies in ending gender-based violence. If you are interested in learning more about this project or becoming involved, please email me at sue@humanecanada.ca. Humane Canada is also on social media, and we encourage you to follow us for updates about the ACT project and Promising Practices project, as well as the incredible work Humane Canada is doing. Also, we feature a lot of cute animal content, so we highly encourage you to follow us. If you would like to connect with the ACT team to learn more about the ACT project and our Promising Practices project, please send us an email. As Claire mentioned, it's our first names at humanecanada.ca. And thank you for joining us today. We truly hope to see you all at our next community of practice, and we would love to answer any questions you may have now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire and Sue. It was lovely to learn more about the ACT project. Lots of your partners are here and responding in the chat, so that's been fun. And shout out as well to the larger Humane Canada team that has also been answering questions in the chat. Very helpful. Folks have been submitting questions, and so we want to take some time to present those to you now. Also, if you haven't been able to ask a question, please feel free to pose it in the question and answer box, and we'll be able to get to it. And to facilitate the Q&A session, I'm happy to be joined by my colleague Sabrid, who is the implementation coordinator for the Knowledge Hub. Okay, and I'm going to start us off with a question. Someone asked, would you be able to provide examples of the link between violence against animals and violence against individuals?
Absolutely. Claire, would you like me to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, if you want
Okay.
to, sure.
So there's lots of different examples, but oftentimes what we're hearing specifically in the context of gender-based violence is that while the survivor is experiencing violence in their relationship, their animal is also experiencing that violence or there's threatened violence. So that might be for the purpose of coercive control. So the aggressor may be intentionally trying to physically harm or threaten to harm or neglect the animal for the purpose of controlling the survivor. That could also be related to the survivor's bond with the animal, as the aggressor may see that as a way of hurting the survivor through being physically abusive or threatening physical abuse. But it can also look like neglect. So that could include refusing to support the survivor in taking the animal to the vet or access food and resources for the animal. So there is some complexity there that could include financial abuse, which could be restraining the funds for the survivor to be able to support their animal, and more examples like that. But what we're really seeing is sort of this entanglement of when humans are experiencing violence, animals are also experiencing violence.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue and Claire for your webinar. There was another question about the role. What role do animals plays in the supporting the healing of survivor?
I can start with that one, but Sue, feel free to jump in. Yeah, I think generally we know that animals are a huge support to many, many people in general. Um, Emotional support, they serve as a confidant, but we really see that role of confidant and support being strengthened and emphasized for survivors of gender-based violence with an animal, especially when you're being socially isolated. That connection that you have to the animal, you're relying on them for social support, like I said, emotional support, mental health support. And so they play a huge role in supporting survivors. They're very healing, very therapeutic. They're our family. So what we really want to do through this project is help people maintain the relationship they have with their animals so that they can heal together.
And I'm just going to do a quick shout out to our case studies and our survivor stories. Our case studies, we actually include a section on every case study where the organization talks about the benefits of animals for survivors. And in our survivor stories and our survivor quotes, survivors just emphasize over and over again the importance of the bond they have with their animals. So we highly encourage folks to go check that out.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so the next question is hoping to expand on one of the modules you mentioned around what it looks like for farm animals and in those types of contexts. And so they're wondering, what are the complications when a survivor shares farm animals with an aggressor on, for instance, a rural or remote farm, and the livelihood connection there?
I'll jump in, but Claire, please feel free to jump in if I miss anything. So there's so many complications there. So starting with the livelihood piece, there's a lot of complexity around property law, which animals are considered property by law, particularly when they're associated with survivor's income and an aggressor's income. So there's lots of complications there around that being divided. There are even complications there when survivors are able to access protective orders. Sometimes those protective orders will still allow for the aggressor to come on property to care for the animals, which does put the survivor at risk. Or sometimes we'll see that survivors are accessing the property because the aggressor's not caring for the animals, and the survivor is trying to make sure their animals are cared for. So lots of complexity there, which leads to farmed animals require a different level of care than a dog or a cat. So depending on the number of animals, the type of animals, it can be quite difficult for survivors to find that care if it's not going to be themselves and if they're not able to bring those animals with them. And then that leads to, if survivors do attempt to bring these animals with them, well, I always like to ask the question, what do you do with 300 cattle? Because that requires space. There are biosecurity concerns, there's insurance concerns, there's a level of expertise for the care, there's transportation concerns. So a lot of complexities there, as well as there's not a lot of services that offer support for survivors with farmed animals. So it can be a really tricky situation for survivors to be in, because even if, let's say, they were to ask a friend or a neighbor to care for those animals who did have that level of expertise, that can actually be a safety risk for themselves, for the friend and the neighbor. And we've also heard from survivors, folks declining because they don't want to get involved because they don't understand what's happening and the violence happening. So there's lots of complexities for those animals and lots of barriers when it comes to farmed animals. That said, I do like to end on a note of hope. There are some really cool, innovative solutions happening in communities. I'm going to shout out Gulf Wellington Women in Crisis, who have been supporting survivors with farmed animals and been really creative in that work.
And I'll just jump in. It's my turn to plug something, Sue, that we do have an educational module, like Sue mentioned, that's specific to supporting survivors in rural, northern, and farming communities. And so, like Sue mentioned, there are many different strategies that might be implemented. But across the board, we've seen that this work is so much more possible when we collaborate and we use expertise from across multiple sectors. So yeah, I would check out that module as well as the case study about Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis is pretty great.
Thank you. I appreciate you both ending us always on hope.
For the next question, there's two questions. So first, it's about the results of the ACT program. When and where the results will be shared?
Yeah. I can start. So the outcomes of the project are being actively shared right now. So lucky for all of us, there is something for you to go and do this afternoon. After this webinar, you can go to the online learning center, which is where all of the educational modules are posted, the case studies, resources, all the wonderful things we've been talking about. And so I believe that link has been shared in the chat, but it's actproject.thinkific.com. And yeah, you can access those kind of outcomes there. I don't know, Sue, if you want to touch on anything else. We always love to have more folks at our community of practice where you can hear about everything that's going on. But Sue, take it away.
And thank you, Claire. I was just going to touch on, we will have a report of everything all the themes that were found. It will be launched closer to the end of the month. And so we're really excited for that. But I also want to do a quick plug for the Learning Network, because they will be launching a newsletter featuring ACT at the end of the month. So that also contains sort of a lot of that data that folks are looking to read.
Thank you. And one last question before I pass the mic to Diane. Is there a clear definition between service animals and support animals?
I'll let you go, Claire.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll start by saying that's part of what's so difficult about that is that Qualifications and definitions regarding service animals specifically is quite fragmented across the country. And so that's part of what can create barriers for survivors needing to flee from one place to another. Generally, service animals are task trained, so they're trained to perform specific tasks, and emotional support animals are more inherent in that they're not necessarily trained, but they provide that emotional support, which is still extremely profound and significant. I would mention we had a community of practice where we focused on supporting survivors with service and emotional support animals, and we had a really fantastic speaker from CNIB Guide Dogs who gave really helpful definitions on the guidelines in terms of service animals across the country and sort of what their rights are, because service animals are a little bit more protected in terms of legislation. So I would encourage anyone to check that out. We also had a really fantastic speaker talk about a service cat, which was really, really informative and wonderful. So lots to learn from both of those experts. And yeah, I don't know, Sue, if you have anything to add to that.
I will just shout out another module. So we do really encourage you to watch our community practice recording because it features three really incredible speakers. But also we have a module specifically on service animals and disability rights that is created by our subject matter expert from CNIB. And it goes really into detail about specifically the definition of service animals, but also looking at how to best support survivors with service animals and how best to support survivors with emotional support animals.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next person, we've had a few questions around this. We're wondering around, do you have any information on healing for the animals that have lived with violence? Anything that's been effective in supporting them?
Yeah, I can start with that one. We're definitely seeing that across the board. A trauma-informed approach is not just for people. We definitely need to be practicing trauma-informed approaches for people and animals because it's important to recognize the trauma that animals are experiencing, both in experiencing violence and in witnessing violence. So definitely taking a trauma-informed approach. Again, we'll do another plug, but we have a module on a trauma-informed approach in animal service settings. And so, yeah, something that's really helpful too is animal service providers and human service providers coming together to share in their expertise. And so when we have human service providers who might not necessarily have the most in-depth understanding of animal behavior and trauma, then we can lean on animal service providers such as animal behavior scientists or trainers or veterinary staff to be able to provide expertise in reading animal body language and understanding stress in animals, anxiety in animals, and all of those things. And so, yeah, I would say it's just, yeah, it's an important thing to take the same kind of approach for both parties. I don't know, Sue, you have anything to add?
I do. So just like you shouted out our trauma-informed care for animal services, we also have trauma-informed care for human services, social services as a module. In that module, we actually do talk about animals and being trauma-informed with animals from the perspective of social services. But I also want to give a shout out because we have some really cool resources. So one of those is like an animal care and reference guide. And it's been written so that if you are starting a pet-friendly shelter and you're not sure what the proper care is for a guinea pig or a cat, it gives sort of those details, but it's written in really survivor-friendly language, so that way you can share it, as well as we do have, because folks seem to be really nervous around dog behavior, we have a specific dog behavior guide that's just a brief resource, but to help folks better understand how to support the animal members of their community.
Thank you. And Claire, I love that as a quote, like trauma-informed approaches are not just for humans, not just for people. I'm going to ask one more question and then pass it back to Sabri. So an individual asked, are the majority of these partner services, the services that you highlighted, available for non-Canadian citizens?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to wonder about that, because that would be so for everything that we're offering on our online resources is available to anyone in the world. So please share it widely. But specific to gender-based violence shelters, I can speak as a previous gender-based violence shelter manager. Absolutely, our services were accessible to anyone fleeing violence, regardless of their status.
That's great. Thank you.
So we have another question. What is the best way to bring awareness to survivors about resources and support in the community, given that the survivors are often isolated?
Sue, do you want me to take this?
I can also take it.
Yeah, you can go ahead. I think, yeah, we're probably on the same page.
So I think particularly our module on awareness, engagement, and confidentiality really touches upon this. Not to plug another module, but really it's about building a community where the community is recognizing cycles of violence and very aware of gender-based violence, so the community is supportive. Because when you build a community like that, when you're educating the community, that means no matter who a survivor goes to, they're going to receive a supportive response. And that's a great way of ensuring that survivors, even if they're not maybe accessing gender-based violence services yet, they access any community member. They're going to be met with a response that's supportive and informed and knowledgeable about what exists inside the community. Claire, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's pretty well said. I would say generally when we have a community that is more trauma informed and is more strengths based, it makes it so much easier to navigate these conversations. So yeah, I would say building up community awareness is a great answer.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is, what can we do to help government realize that existing domestic violence funds should include family pets, animals, counting as survivors too, and increase subsidies? And are there already financial resources available through government to help agencies in wanting to do this work?
So I want to give a really great shout out to Bethesda House, because they are doing something really cool and innovative. And if you watch their module, you'll learn more about it. But what they're doing is when they report to government, because they are a pet-friendly shelter, they actually report their animal stats as well, even though it's not requested. And so reporting stats like that can be a really helpful way of letting folks know that this is needed. But this is also where I'm going to give a shout out to our advocacy guide that's going to be released shortly, because our advocacy guide really goes in depth on how you can advocate on various levels within community with funders to ensure folks are aware of the need to support survivors' whole families, so both human and animal family members. So I would highly encourage folks to check that out. Sorry, because that's through advocacy, through community building, we can actually raise that awareness that's needed.
Yes, wonderful. And I appreciate what you said, Sue, as well. It's even if you don't have a pet-friendly shelter at this point, you can start collecting those statistics, like who would have wanted to have come and how many pets do they have. So that can really help with the advocacy part as well. Thank you.
We have another questions related to collaboration. Is there any collaboration with a veterinarian with the gender-based survivors?
Yes, these collaborations are huge, especially when we know that often in co-sheltering programs or off-site sheltering programs, There are medical requirements for animals, so they might need to be vaccinated, they might need to have a general exam, and so getting veterinary staff on board is so crucial to decreasing that barrier for a survivor. Especially when a lot of the time a survivor might not have access to their documentation, they might not necessarily be able to prove that their animal's up to date on vaccines or whatever the case may be. It's really fantastic when there are veterinary staff and veterinary services connected to off-site and co-sheltering programs, so that the animal is really taken care of in more ways than one. I don't know, Sue, if you have a specific example in mind, but we do have several case studies of organizations that work together with veterinary clinics. There are a lot of confidentiality pieces that are involved in providing those services. But yeah, Sue, if you have a specific example, it might be interesting.
Yeah, well, I was just going to touch on that. A lot of times veterinary folks may actually experience like disclosures from survivors that they're experiencing violence, or they may recognize signs of animal abuse or gender-based violence happening, and they may not know what to do. So there's lots of great veterinary folks that are educated in gender-based violence and building those partnerships. But if you don't have that partnership in your community, I will say gender-based violence organizations can be a really nice partner for veterinary clinics to offer them that education, offer them that support, so they know what to say to someone if someone discloses and how to connect them to help. And then it's kind of that mutual collaboration where they're able to offer them that potential veterinary support for survivors that are accessing gender-based violence programs. So another plug, our collaboration guide goes in depth about how to build those partnerships, but also our module awareness, engagement, and confidentiality kind of talks through how to engage in those partnerships, but also confidentiality considerations in those spaces. And I will also say, if you're a gender-based violence organization thinking about reaching out to a veterinary clinic, we have some really great awareness resources that you can download from our website, put your logo on, and take to the clinic in a way of building that relationship, because sometimes offering someone resources is a really great way to get a partnership started.
Thank you, thank you. It's a very good idea, and I also want to take some time to shout out the community veterinary outreach that provides free vet and social services in Vancouver, Kelowna, Winnipeg, Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, Guelph, Kitchener-Waterloo, and York regions for those on social assistance or vulnerability housed.
Thank you. And I think we'll move to the last question, and it's a broad question, but someone is wondering, what is one key takeaway that you want for a service provider to know? And perhaps to that I'll add, what's one key takeaway they can like implement right now, do today? And what's one thing you'd like to see them do to support like broader systemic change?
Do you want me to go first, Claire?
Sure.
So what I would like service providers to do today is recognize the importance of the bond survivors have with their animals. Sometimes survivors have shared with us that, when they have a reaction of, it's just a dog, or it's just a horse, or it's just a whatever, that discourages them from continuing to access support. So even if you're not able to offer them support today, and again, another shout out for a resource, we actually have a resource talking about, if you're not able to offer support today, what can you do to better support survivors? So even if you can't help them with their animal today, just acknowledging the importance of the bond and helping them safety plan in a way that includes their animals can be such an effective strategy of supporting survivors and reaching out again for support. It's really meaningful to make sure that you include their animals in any safety planning that you do, and acknowledge that bond. But for tomorrow, what I would like service providers to do is collaborate. You are not in this alone, and building relationships with other organizations in your region, whether they be other gender-based violence organizations or whether they be animal service organizations, is how you'll be able to build programs that better support survivors. There's so many examples of this on the ACT to Keep Families Safe online learning center. So collaborate, collaborate, collaborate is my second point, and I will pass it to Claire.
Thank you. You stole the words right out of my mouth. I think, yeah, that first step is so scary. And when you look at all the work that needs to be done, it can be so tremendously overwhelming. So I think that really focusing on small, achievable actions like we've been talking about is such a great place to start, whether that's considering how you might implement support for survivors within your organization, which, like Sue said, that might mean just discussing that in safety planning. It could mean asking about it on intake and seeing if it's a barrier for survivors when they're coming into shelter. Or thinking about different partnerships that you might want to create. And like Sue said, validating the bond between a person and their animal is it's so huge, it's so affirming. So I think those are all really great places to start, but really focusing on those small achievable actions, kind of one thing at a time. And then seeing if you can work together with someone else that can help you work towards the common goal, because like we've said, it's really hard to do this work alone, and it doesn't need to be done alone. So, yeah, I would say, yeah, small achievable actions and working on those partnerships.
That's wonderful. I like how you phrased it, Sue, today and tomorrow. So we are going to close off the webinar now. Thank you so much for joining us, Claire and Sue. Thank you for joining for the Q&A, Sabri. I as well want to thank all of our interpreters. So our ASL interpreters, Amanda and Jennifer, our LSQ interpreters, Emily and Linda, and the French language interpreters, Christiane and Carolyn. And don't forget, after the webinar closes, a webinar evaluation will automatically open in your browser. After you complete that optional evaluation, you'll be redirected to receive your certificate of participation. And like Claire mentioned, if you have the time, use the rest of the afternoon to get on the the online learning center that the ACT project has set up and access all these amazing resources that we've just heard about. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.